Hi there guys, I hope you have had a good day. Now Anthony Joshua was talking about his protege, Joshua Buatsi, and his victory over Marco Kalic, and he explained that during early on in his career, if he would knock his opponent out in round 1, 2 or 3, or early into the fight, he would go back into the dressing room and finish the rounds on the pads. So say he knocked his opponent out in round 1, he would go back to the dressing room and do 11 rounds on the pads. And what he was trying to do and achieve by doing this was get that mentality and conditioning for 12 rounds. So he knows that going into this fight, he's doing 12 rounds. I mean, he's not, because obviously he was knocking his opponents out early on into the fight, but he knew in his mind that he's doing 12 rounds no matter what happens. If he finishes his opponent early on into the contest, he knows he's going back to the changing room to finish off the rounds, to go full 12 rounds. So ultimately, what that does is not only conditions him physically, but conditions him mentally to know that there are 12 hard rounds ahead of him, whether it's in the dressing room or in the fight. Now, obviously, 12 rounds in a fight versus 12 rounds on the pads in the dressing room after are two completely different things. But obviously, Anthony Joshua is not trying to replicate a fight when he does those pads in the dressing room. But what he is trying to do is condition and train his mind and his physicality to make sure that there are 12 rounds in the tank, so that when he's going out there against opponents he is supposed to be beating, opponents he should be knocking over, because ultimately before the fight, these fighters are put in there with Anthony Joshua, and they are never expected to beat him until he gets to around 11, 12 and 0. That's when he starts fighting fighters who are there to give him a challenge, who represent a tougher test than fights previous. But what Anthony Joshua was trying to achieve is that when those fights come, when he starts going beyond 3 or 4 rounds, because in his first 10 contests or more, he hadn't been out of, 3 or 4 rounds. So ultimately going from that, then starting to step up against fighters who do start taking him rounds, because Dillian Whyte was the first fighter to take Anthony Joshua 7 rounds. And that was Anthony Joshua's 15th fight. So for 14 fights previous to that Dillian Whyte fight for the British title, he hadn't gone beyond 3 or 4 rounds. So ultimately what he had done in all of those fights was went back to the changing rooms and finished the rounds off with his trainer. And again, that's not going to be like a real fight. Obviously, those extra few rounds against Dillian Whyte would have been extremely more intense than a couple rounds on the pads, because obviously the pads don't hit back. He's in there with an opponent like Dillian Whyte who punches very hard and will not give up. So it's different, but it's not just about the physicality of it, it's about the mental training as well. Because just 3 fights after that Dillian Whyte fight, he hadn't been beyond the 7th round, and he was in there with Vladimir Klitschko. Klitschko took him 11 rounds, and Anthony Joshua went through all of it in there. I mean, that fight gave him more experience than all of his other fights put together, because Anthony Joshua knocked Klitschko down, was on top. Then he got fatigued and tired, and realised that you cannot just empty the tank that early on into the contest against someone with the experience of Vladimir Klitschko. But Anthony Joshua was mentally preparing himself for that long before that time even came, before he had to go beyond 3 or 4 rounds. This is what Anthony Joshua had to say about his unique training regime. When I used to fight, right when I used to box early in my career, back in the day, after I used to fight, I was scheduled for a 10-rounder, and obviously I'd go and double them over in 1-2 rounds and that. So there'll be 8 rounds left. I'll have to go back into the changing rooms and I'll finish training. I knew the day when it comes to do 12 rounds, even though I'm blitzing men out of there before the 12 rounds, I knew I had to train my body to go the distance. So obviously this is quite a unique technique, but one Anthony Joshua used to physically prepare himself to go beyond where he was fighting, because you see many fighters who don't often go out of those first couple of rounds early on into their careers. I mean, Deontay Wilder was one who was also knocking a lot of people out, but not at the same level as Anthony Joshua. I mean, he was like 30, 32 and 0 before he even had to step up from what would be domestic level for him. I mean, he just went after fight, just knocking guys over, some blown up middleweights as well Deontay Wilder was in the ring with. But the difference is between Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua is Anthony Joshua did not neglect his boxing finesse, his boxing abilities, because that was one thing that he was always working on. So when the unthinkable happened and he lost to Andy Ruiz Jr., he had that boxing to go back to, because in the early rounds of that fight, he was outboxing Andy Ruiz. So he had that in the bank. He knew that he could go back to basics. And that is part and parcel to having these experiences early on into his career. I mean, knocking guys over in 2 or 3 rounds doesn't teach a fighter all that much. It's when they get to the higher levels, when they start fighting the Dillian Whytes for Anthony Joshua, that is when he truly starts learning, because before that, I mean, he's just getting started, getting his feet wet into the sport of pro boxing. Because even though Anthony Joshua was an accomplished amateur, considering he didn't have that many amateur fights, I mean, he was Olympic gold medalist, so you would think that, okay, he's a gold medalist, he's a good boxer, let's move him quickly. But there was no rush, because Anthony Joshua turned pro when he was 23 years old, so he was still very young when he turned over to the professional ranks. He had been probably an amateur for 4 or 5 years before turning over to the professional ranks, because he started boxing when he was 18 years old. So some would say he started boxing late, but he has moved extremely fast, especially through the amateur ranks, then winning a gold medal as well at the Olympics. So he has that behind him, but that does not mean that he can jump straight to, like a Dillian Whyte fight or a Klitschko fight. He needs those learning fights, even though it seems like he's just going in there and knocking out guy after guy. That's not important. What is important is that he steps up step by step. But the thing is, he was going through those guys, then he got to Dillian Whyte, then it was a world title fight straight after that. So he went from British level straight to world level, skipping European. And then Anthony Joshua defended that IBF world title that he won in his 16th fight against Charles Martin. He defended it against Dominic Brazil, knocking him out in 7 rounds. Then Eric Molina, knocking him out in 3 rounds. So still, Anthony Joshua had not been beyond 7 rounds and he was a world champion going into his 19th fight against Vladimir Klitschko. So then he was straight into the deep end at elite level in a unification fight with Vladimir Klitschko. Obviously, he fought for the IBF world title that he held and the vacant WBA and IBO world titles. So Anthony Joshua was straight into the deep end with Vladimir Klitschko, and all of those fights he had had previous, even the 2 or 3 rounders, were building him towards that point. And hitting the pads in the changing rooms after those fights, even though he would win in 2 or 3 rounds, many fighters would just go home, or it would be the end for them. They would go clubbing or something like that and celebrate. Anthony Joshua was still working, so his mentality was, keep working while the others are resting, and that will be the difference when we get into the ring. So you can see that this training regimen that Anthony Joshua was doing early on into his career wasn't physical, it was mostly mental, giving him that mental edge. He knows he's going 12 rounds no matter what happens. He knows that before he steps into the ring. Whether it's in the ring or on the pads after, 12 rounds is what he will do. So he knows that he's mentally and physically conditioned to do those 12 rounds on fight night. Guys, anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments below, leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you are new. Thanks guys.